The young and the restless spoilers. Mariah had convinced herself for so long that love and persistence could rewrite the past. That enough devotion could somehow erase the images of Abby and Devin in Dominic's heart and replace them with her own. But reality had a cruel way of grinding down that fantasy until all that was left was exhaustion and a desperate, brittle kind of obsession. From the outside, it was easy for others to say that Dominic's life had already been written, that his story had been woven around Abby and Devin from the very beginning, and nothing, no matter how intense or sincere, could untether the boy from the bond he shared with them. Deep down, Mariah had always known that, but she refused to accept it, clinging instead to the idea that if she just tried harder, if she just stayed one more night by his side, made one more sacrifice, proved one more time that she would do anything for him, the universe would eventually reward her by letting her become his mother in all the ways that mattered. When that reward never came, when Dominic continued to look past her for the familiar safety of Abby's voice and Devin's arms, something inside her shifted from hurt into something sharper. Something that mixed love with resentment until the two were indistinguishable. She told herself that Abby and Devin had had their chance, that they had made choices which left Dominic needing someone stronger, more constant, less fragile than the people who had broken her heart by pulling him away. She told herself that she was the only one who really understood what it meant to suffer for him. Every lie she told to justify her behavior wrapped a little tighter around them both, and before long, those lies were no longer just a protective story in her head but a web that trapped Dominic in a version of reality that served her need to belong more than it served his need to breathe. At first it was little things that Dominic noticed but could not quite put into words, the way Mariah would tense whenever he mentioned Abby's name, the way her eyes flickered when he asked when they were going home, the way her voice took on a strangely bright, forced tone when she insisted that everything was fine and that he did not need anyone but her. Children sense inconsistency more keenly than adults are willing to admit, and Dominic's world, once anchored by routine and familiar faces, began to feel off balance as the number of Mariah's small, desperate deceptions multiplied. She told him Abby was too busy, that Devin was away for a while, that it was better if they had time just the two of them, and each time she said it, she believed she was buying herself more space to prove how much she loved him. But Dominic's trust is not a currency one can purchase with repetition, and instead of soothing him, her words created a growing storm of confusion and anger in his little chest. He began to push back in the only ways a child knows how, tantrums that came out of nowhere, defiant glares where there had once been easy smiles, stubborn silence when she pleaded with him to cooperate. His games became more aggressive, his laughter more manic, his tears more frequent, as emotions too big for his body crashed against the walls of a life that no longer made sense. When Mariah would tell him one thing and his instincts screamed another, when the memory of Abby's gentle touch and Devin's steady warmth rose up in him, the dissonance made him lash out. He would refuse to listen, would turn away, would scream until his throat went raw, would throw himself onto the floor in a refusal that went deeper than simply not wanting to obey. In those moments, Mariah felt not only powerless but personally rejected, as if each shout and each act of defiance were a direct indictment of her worth as a mother. As if the child she loved was standing in judgment over every mistake she had ever made. The more Dominic refused to bend, the more she tightened her grip, unable to see that her need for control was the very thing ripping his sense of safety apart. The pressure inside Mariah built day after day, fed by sleepless nights and spiraling thoughts, by memories of the time when she had been the one carrying Dominic's life within her and believing that nothing and no one would ever be allowed to come between them. She replayed the decision to give him back over and over again, hearing again the echoes of her own sobs and the hollow, echoing emptiness that had followed. That emptiness had never truly left. It had simply been layered over with busyness and denial, waiting beneath the surface for the first crack to appear. Dominic's growing rebellion tore that crack wide open. Every time he shouted that he wanted Abby or asked for Devin, it felt to Mariah like a reminder that she was still on the outside of a family that would never fully claim her. Her fear that she would be abandoned again warped into an urgent conviction that she had to prevent that outcome at any cost. She began to think in terms of winning and losing instead of loving and letting go, as if this child were a contested territory instead of a human being. And because she was exhausted and scared, she started to believe that force might succeed where gentle pleading and self-sacrifice had failed. The first time she grabbed his arms a little too tightly to stop him running, she told herself it was just to keep him safe. The first time she raised her voice louder than she ever had before, she told herself he needed to learn that she meant what she said. But the scene quickly escalated beyond what she had imagined. Dominic, already overstimulated and confused, panicked at the sudden shift, his cries rising in pitch and volume until they seemed to bounce off the walls. In that frantic chaos, with her own heart pounding and her mind racing, Mariah did something she would never have believed herself capable of doing when she had first cradled him in the dim light of a hospital room. She decided that the only way to restore order was to restrain him. The act of tying Dominic down was not planned, not part of some coldly calculated strategy, but rather the breakdown of a person who had lost sight of the line between protection and possession. Maybe it was a scarf left on the back of a chair, maybe a belt, maybe something grabbed blindly from a drawer. Whatever it was, it became an instrument of her desperation as she wrapped it around the small wrists that had once rested so trustingly against her collarbone. Dominic's eyes widened in disbelief more than fear at first, as if his mind could not immediately process that the person who had sung him to sleep, who had wiped away his tears, was now binding him in place. The confusion in his gaze cut far deeper than any scream could have, but Mariah was beyond reasoning with herself by then. Her thoughts were a tangled chorus insisting that this was necessary, that once he calmed down, once he stopped fighting, once he listened, they could go back to some kind of peace. She told herself that she was simply containing the situation, that a good mother sometimes had to do hard things for the sake of her child's safety. But those rationalizations could not drown out the sight of him struggling against the bonds, cheeks flushed, breath coming in ragged gasps. The wordless plea in his eyes louder than the hoarse sounds that came out of his throat. He stopped hearing her explanations and began to hear only the sound of his own fear, with every twist of his small body, his trust frayed like the fabric cutting into his skin. The room where Mariah had once dreamed they would build a new life together transformed into a place of captivity, and she did not even recognize how far she had crossed the line. Because all she could focus on was the idea that if she just kept him with her long enough, he would eventually accept that she was the one he belonged to. Outside of that room, the world had not gone still. Abby and Devin felt the absence of their son like a physical ache, a constant wrongness that no distraction could erase. At first, they tried to tell themselves that they were overreacting, that Mariah simply needed time, that maybe a temporary arrangement had become messier than expected, but that nothing truly terrible was happening. Yet a parent's intuition is not easily quieted. Each unanswered message and each vague response chipped away at their attempts to remain calm. They replayed their last interactions with Mariah, searching for any sign they had missed, any flicker of instability or distress that could have warned them that she was slipping into a darker space. Regret gnawed at them, the knowledge that they had asked too much of her, that they had relied on her lingering attachment to Dominic while urging her to move on at the same time, creating a contradictory deadlock inside her that was bound to fracture. They sat in their respective spaces, Abby in a house full of memories, Devin surrounded by a life he had painstakingly rebuilt, feeling equally helpless, united by the same fear. Every minute they spent wondering how their son was doing, whether he was eating, sleeping, crying, or reaching out for them only to find empty air. Deep in the sense that they had lost control of a situation they should have safeguarded more carefully. Their restlessness was not just about missing him, it was about an increasing sense that something had tipped into dangerous territory. That Mariah's silence was no longer the quiet of someone overwhelmed but the barricade of someone hiding what she had done. Inside the room, the dynamic between Mariah and Dominic deteriorated rapidly. The more he struggled, the more she felt herself split in two. One part of her stood aside, horrified, watching this scene as if it were happening to strangers, wanting to rush in and free him, to gather him up and apologize until her voice broke. The other part, louder, harder, forged from years of feeling less than, disposable, second choice, insisted that this was the only way to prevent him from being taken from her again. That she was finally being strong instead of letting herself be walked over. She tried to soothe him with words that no longer landed, telling him that she loved him, that she would never hurt him, that he just needed to stop shouting, to stop kicking, to just listen. But to Dominic, those words felt like another layer of confusion. Love did not look like knots digging into his wrists. Love did not sound like a voice that trembled between pleading and frustration. With each passing hour, the initial shock gave way to a cold, aching disillusionment that no child should ever have to experience. He realized, in a way that was less rational thought and more instinct, that the person he had once associated with comfort was no longer safe. His pleas, whether spoken or choked out between sobs, were ignored, brushed aside, or drowned in justifications he was too young to understand. His world shrank to the length of the restraints, to the walls of the room, to the shape of Mariah's shadow as it fell across him. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a wary, winded stare that followed her every move, not with trust, but with suspicion. For Mariah, the turning point was not a single dramatic event but a growing awareness that everything she was doing in the name of love was having the opposite effect. The more she tried to force Dominic to accept her version of reality, the more he recoiled, and the more he recoiled, the more she had to face the fact that what she was fighting for was no longer about his well-being but about her own inability to let go. The weight of what she had done accumulated in her chest like stones, making it hard to breathe, harder still to look him in the eyes. She began to notice the small details that had been invisible to her when she was consumed by fear, the way Dominic flinched when she reached toward him, the way his entire body tensed at the sound of her footsteps, the way he no longer reached out instinctively for contact or comfort. These were not the reactions of a child who was simply going through a phase of misbehavior. They were the early signs of trauma. Seeds of mistrust that would continue to grow long after the ropes were untied. It became impossible to pretend she was protecting him when every visible sign screamed that he needed protection from the situation she had created. Outside, Abby and Devon's anxiety had deepened into a determination that something had to change, that they could no longer wait and hope for reassurance that never came. Inside, Mariah's narrative of herself as the wronged, overlooked mother gave way, piece by painful piece, to the recognition that she had crossed lines that could not easily be erased. She realized that Dominic's emotional distance was not the result of Abby and Devon poisoning his mind against her. It was a direct consequence of her own choices. In the end, the simplest truth cut through all of Mariah's justifications. Dominic no longer trusted her. It was there in the way he refused to meet her gaze, in the way his body stiffened when she came near, in the way every muscle in him screamed for freedom even when he had grown too exhausted to physically fight. There came a moment, one of those quiet, devastating moments where no one else was watching, when she saw herself reflected in his eyes not as the savior she had imagined, but as the source of his fear. And something inside her finally broke in the way it needed to. The rage that had been fueling her for so long burned out, leaving only ash and a hollow sense of shame. She understood, with a clarity that hurt, that by trying to force him to belong to her, she had shattered the fragile bond they once shared, and that every second she kept him tied. Every second she kept pretending this was for his good, deepened the wound. Outside, Abby and Devon were still frantic, still questioning what steps to take, still wondering if they should have intervened sooner or demanded different boundaries. Inside, Mariah's hands shook as she hovered over the knots, torn between the part of her that still feared losing him and the part that finally recognized that the only way to stop this spiral was to let go. Dominic did not need more explanations or excuses. He did not need more promises that things would be different. He needed the simplest, most immediate act of love that she could offer in that moment, to be released, to be allowed to run back into the arms of the people whose presence had always anchored him. To feel once again that the world was a place where adults could be trusted to keep him safe. Everything had become terrible because she could not accept that his life was tied to Abby and Devon in ways she could not rewrite. Now, faced with the sight of the boy she had once sworn to protect reduced to a trembling, silent shell of himself, she knew that clinging any further would only finish destroying him. The plea hanging in the air, even if he no longer had the strength to voice it, was unmistakable: let him go.